Almost there. Good afternoon, cider people at CraftCon 2021. It's my utmost pleasure to welcome Sigrid from Lallemand up onto the main stage to just talk us a little bit about yeast and nutrition and some general fermentation talk, covering some of the topics that have been brought up over the last few sessions. So I'll leave you in good hands with Sigrid, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Simon. And coming to you live from the yurt in Denmark, I'd love to speak. I think what I was hoping to cover a little bit today was just this idea that with some of the conversations I've had and in the last day or so, is to speak a little bit about what Lallemand is and can do. I think Lallemand is seen very often as a yeast company, and indeed Lallemand does produce and develop and do everything about yeast, both dead and alive. And that's just this idea of perhaps of giving a little bit of a broader view rather than just the specifics of, what about this yeast or what about that yeast. A little bit of an overview in terms of what the portfolio is, in terms of what we otherwise have available. Although there's very much a focus on wine, and we're not looking to relabel wine yeast as a cider yeast. We'd prefer to just describe that yeast and see how it fits well with a certain profile. We're certainly looking at some of the more specific cider yeast, and in that case, they would be then known as cider yeast. But until that time, I think we're using our knowledge, our current knowledge of yeast, to be able to help give some different aromas, complexity, that is available from using some of these different yeast. But there's a whole other world in terms of bacteria, which is when, even if you're doing a wild fermentation, is knowing a little bit more about what is going on. Bacteria tend to be the little silent ones in the background. So knowing more about what they can do, positive and sometimes negative, is also valuable, and we'd love to share that information. I think even more interesting for me in terms of some of the recent R&D work we've been doing is the nutrition. Expecting a yeast wild fermentation or an inoculated yeast to perform at a certain level and give you the right aromas without supporting it in the background with some of the nutrition is really worth looking into, even if you apply it on different levels as an organic nutrition or a more intense nutrient regime. The specific yeast derivatives I'll mention in a moment, just in terms of protecting your cider, especially now with having to look at perhaps larger stocks than normal for the next year or year and a bit, how to protect that cider over time without necessarily adding SO2. Enzymes, always a hot topic, but perhaps for me is, even if I've spoken to many people that are interested or use wild fermentations, even if you have the most fantastic wild fermentation and the most complex cider, to leave it unprotected, and even if you're doing a low SO2 strategy, you might want to consider something like a chitosan product, a no Brett inside, avoiding that another organism comes in and masks all those lovely cider aromas. So something like no Brett inside or Bactiless, decreasing the load of those organisms that could really negatively affect your cider over time is really worth looking into, which regardless whether you're doing a wild fermentation or adding a nutrient, adding a yeast. So the typical question is, what type of yeast do I add? And very often we recommend strong yeast if it's the first time, because we hope in any case that any fermentation will succeed to the goals of the cider maker. But it is worth looking at. There are so many other options that even if you are doing one way, put something aside, even if it's 20 liters, and try something that is more exciting in terms of aromas, in terms of complexity. There are so many interesting yeast out there. And even if we're just looking here at some of the sort of the superstars of fermentation world, the Saccharomyces yeast, there are also some non-Saccharomyces that do really well in cider. So that's also something to look at. But it's the name of complexity, adding different yeasts, trying something new, and perhaps being surprised at how well some of these different yeasts are able to add a fantastic level of complexity to your cider. Particularly if you have a yeast that doesn't produce any or very low levels of H2S. That seems to be a recurring theme in cider fermentations. Sometimes an orchard or a fermentation will do fantastically well, and other times there will be a blossoming of some H2S aromas. Fundamentally, it's probably related back to the nutrition and the lack of nutrition available to a yeast during the course of a fermentation. So having a yeast that is naturally selected to produce very low H2S can really help to develop the real aromas that are in the cider, because H2S will mask some of these more delicate aromas. And again, coming through to something that perhaps in the wine world is seen as a co-inoculation. I get very excited when there was a session on co-inoculation or co-fermentations. For me, co-inoculation or co-fermentation has other implications. And in higher alcohol, this yeast strain, the Biodiva, cannot achieve higher alcohols, but certainly in a cider world, up to 8 to 10%, even sometimes 10, 11% alcohol. The Biodiva is a non-Saccharomyces yeast that has some completely different enzymes, has some contributions that are very interesting for a cider in terms of the mouthfeel, in terms of the sort of cake spice, apple tart aromas that can come through, that are known from this yeast and can really complement a cider fermentation. So there's so much out there. It's worth looking into and at least dabbling in it and to see how that can affect it. But I guess fundamentally it comes back down to looking at what is available to the fermentation in terms of the yeast nutritional needs. Sugar is not an issue. Nitrogen is definitely an issue in terms of having the yeast supported. Looking at lipids and oxygen is something we've looked at a great deal over the last 10, 20 years. But even more so, I think, in terms of minerals and vitamins and what is in cider. What is cider? We've lots of research on grapes, but what is in cider and apple juice? So looking how all these different elements come together and provide an evolution of what is good nutrition and how we can apply that to yeast, regardless if it's mead or perry or cider. It's really looking at what makes the yeast tick, what makes them happy. So we're looking in this case looking specifically at some of these different complexes that are in cider and apple. In this case, it's a concentrate because we're looking at different ones. We also have some juice examples, but just to give an example of what are the different sugars. Fructose is often higher than glucose. The Saccharomyces yeast are often glucophilic. They prefer the glucose. So that's helping. The nutrition helps the yeast deal with the more fructose that can be difficult to ferment at the end of a fermentation. Looking at the different amino acids, and this in the case of a concentrate, you have to divide by 5 to look at what the yen is. So you're dropping below 100 to what the yeast prefer to ferment with in terms of a healthy amount of nitrogen to complete the fermentation, not necessarily faster, but just in a healthy fermentation, as I was referring to before in terms of vitality, and looking at the different vitamins. So a lot of different research looking at being able to put something together with our knowledge of yeast as a fermade cider, fermade C, and more specifically looking at what is missing in a cider that can help the yeast do a better job. So fermade C, we'll be doing a launch webinar, seminar. Join us for that party soon. But then just going away from yeast for a moment, because that's a conversation that can take much more than 10 minutes, is also in terms of bacteria, not necessarily relying on whichever bacteria. And even if you are, knowing that there are conditions that will increase the buttery aroma, if there's citric acid available, if there's yeast that are there to absorb some of the diacetyl, the buttery aroma can really cover some of those more delicate cider aromas. So if you're afraid of malolactic, don't be afraid. Learn to understand what makes the bacteria do what you want it to do and not necessarily come in and cover up some aromas. And then the last little bit is managing the oxidation, especially if we have a longer period of storage coming up with some ciders that may not be able to sell as quickly, or have some stock last year and then having more harvest come in the fall. And it's really looking at innovation through tradition. How does that lees protect the cider over time without necessarily using SO2? So if we were to look at an example here, looking at a full dose of sulfites, we can look at details at another time, and then a half dose of sulfites. But then the half dose of sulfites with an inactive yeast called Pure Lees Longevity, 100% natural, but how it can maintain the color in a product, and looking at that. And then finally, the mother of all, or the king of natural, the mother of all natural antioxidants, following the theme of this morning's seminar of women. So looking at these natural yeast components that are able to block oxidation, and that could be something, even if you're not interested in doing using yeast or bacteria or anything else, could be something very valuable in terms of a natural product that can help protect your cider. So that was a little bit of an insight into Lallemand, and looking forward very much to being able to speak to you in the future about some of these different aspects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sigrid. That was brilliant. Always informative. We are still live, but that was excellent. Really, really good. Some great comments coming up on the chat there as well. So I think people will come and talk to you about getting to the nitty gritty of yeast and all those nutrients and things. And there's some really cool, interesting things that I will have to have conversations with you about as well. And great to see that.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk here. Thanks.
No problem at all. And the emphasis on cider is terrific. Brilliant. Thank you, Sigrid.